Ruth, a confident and vibrant woman, was ready to enjoy a peaceful afternoon at an art gallery. The sun was shining, and everything seemed perfect until an unexpected encounter with a security guard turned her visit into a nightmare. Unjustly accused and humiliated in front of other visitors, Ruth's resilience and inner strength were put to the test. As tensions escalated, her determination to stand against discrimination took center stage. What seemed like a simple gallery visit soon became a powerful battle for dignity and justice. How will the truth come to light, and what will the outcome be? If you are not subscribed, I recommend you subscribe and activate the bell so you don't miss any videos. Before we dive into this story, please let me know in the comments where you're watching from. On a golden, radiant afternoon, where the air seemed to hum with the promise of tranquility, Ruth, a woman of striking confidence and grace, made her way down the city's lively streets. The sunlight wrapped her in its warm embrace, casting a soft glow on her deep, caramel skin, which shimmered with life as she walked. Her dark brown eyes, intense yet calm, sparkled with an inner strength, the kind of strength that comes from a lifetime of perseverance. Ruth wasn't just beautiful, she was magnetic, radiating an energy that drew people in, though today she paid little attention to the curious glances she received. Her long, flowing blue dress fluttered gently in the breeze, moving with her as if nature itself bowed in awe of her presence. The dress, like Ruth's, was simple but elegant, a symbol of her understated sophistication. She walked with purpose, each step deliberate and sure, as if the very earth beneath her feet recognized her power. Draped casually over her shoulder was a brown leather bag, well worn but timeless, another testament to her unique style. Today, however, was not just another day, it was special. Ruth had heard about the latest exhibition at the prestigious Floors Gallery, an exhibition she had been eagerly anticipating. Art for Ruth was not simply a pastime, it was a sanctuary, a refuge from the chaos of life, a place where she could lose herself in the colors and textures of paintings and sculptures, escaping the demands of the world for just a little while. From a young age, art had been her escape, a portal to another dimension where beauty reigned supreme, and the harshness of reality softened in the face of creativity. It was a world where she could breathe freely, where her soul could find peace and inspiration. And today she longed for that escape, to immerse herself in the beauty and wonder of the gallery, leaving behind the weight of everyday struggles. As she approached Floors Gallery, Ruth felt her anticipation build. The sleek, modern facade of the building, with its towering glass windows that allowed glimpses of the art inside, seemed to beckon her, promising hours of serenity and reflection. Her heart fluttered with excitement as she imagined the masterpieces awaiting her. The colors, the textures, the emotions captured within each piece, it was all waiting for her, ready to sweep her away into a world of imagination and beauty. A small smile played at the corners of her lips as she gazed at the building, appreciating its architectural beauty as a prelude to the art it contained. For Ruth, this was more than just a visit, it was a pilgrimage, a journey to reconnect with a part of herself that the busyness of life sometimes obscured. As Ruth climbed the marble steps leading to the gallery's grand entrance, she took a moment to observe the world around her. The street was alive with movement, people hurrying by, cars whizzing past, the city buzzing with its usual energy. She loved watching people, imagining the stories they carried, the battles they fought silently. In those brief moments, she felt a connection to something larger than herself, a shared humanity that reminded her that everyone around her was navigating their journey, just as she was. But today, she was ready to leave that behind for a few precious hours, to step into the gallery and lose herself in the stillness and beauty of the art that awaited her. If you're still tuned into this video and find the story inspiring, drop a 1 in the comments to let me know you're still with me. However, as Ruth reached for the door, ready to step into the sanctuary she had envisioned, a shadow suddenly loomed in front of her. Her heart sank as she looked up and saw Bruno, the gallery's security guard, standing squarely in her path. Tall and imposing, with a presence that demanded attention, Bruno was hard to miss. His sharp features and piercing gaze were framed by a perfectly tailored black uniform, every detail immaculate, every button polished to a shine. His posture was rigid, almost military-like, with his arms crossed firmly over his chest, exuding an air of authority that was impossible to ignore. His expression was cold, his eyes scanning Ruth with a look that felt far too invasive for a simple entrance into an art gallery. "Can I help you?" Bruno's voice cut through the quiet air like a blade, sharp and unwelcoming. There was no warmth, no trace of the politeness one might expect when greeting a visitor. Instead, his tone was filled with suspicion, as if Ruth's mere presence outside the gallery was an affront to its sanctity. Ruth, taken aback by his abruptness, blinked in surprise but remained composed. She had been looking forward to this moment all day, and she wasn't about to let a rude security guard ruin it. She smiled softly, her voice calm and polite. "I'm here for the exhibition." But Bruno didn't move. Instead, his eyes narrowed, and he took a step closer, his gaze scrutinizing her from head to toe with an intensity that made Ruth's skin crawl. "Are you sure you're in the right place?" His voice dripped with condescension, the implication clear. A wave of disbelief washed over Ruth. The gallery, a space meant to celebrate creativity, diversity, and expression, was suddenly the scene of an unwelcome interrogation. Bruno's words, simple as they were, carried the weight of judgment, the sting of prejudice. Ruth felt her heart race, her calm exterior beginning to crack under the pressure of his blatant disrespect. She could feel the eyes of the few passers-by who had paused to watch, their gazes piercing, but silent, offering no intervention, no solidarity. "I believe I am," Ruth replied, her voice still steady, though now tinged with an unmistakable edge. She wasn't one to back down easily, but she was also careful not to let her rising frustration spill over. She had learned long ago that battles won with grace were far more powerful than those fought with anger. Bruno, however, wasn't done. He unfolded his arms and gestured toward the gallery doors, his lips curling into a smirk. "We have rules here, and we don't just let anyone in. I'm going to need to see some ID." The humiliation hit Ruth like a punch to the stomach. Her heart pounded in her chest, the weight of the situation sinking in. This wasn't just about a visit to an art gallery anymore. This was about her identity, her dignity, and the deep-seated prejudice that had reared its ugly head in a place where it had no business being. She could feel the onlookers watching, their silence like a suffocating blanket wrapped around her, amplifying the sense of isolation. Why wasn't anyone speaking up? Why did they just stand there passive as she was subjected to this unfair treatment? But Ruth wasn't just a visitor. She wasn't merely another art enthusiast. She was an artist, a featured artist. The very exhibition Bruno was guarding so fiercely contained her creations, the pieces she had poured her heart and soul into. The irony of the situation was almost unbearable. She, the creator of the art displayed inside, was being treated as though she didn't belong, as though her presence was a threat to the sanctity of the space she had helped shape. Taking a deep breath, Ruth squared her shoulders and lifted her chin, her eyes locking with Bruno's. "I think you're making a mistake," she said, her voice now firm and unwavering. "I am not just here for the exhibition. I am one of the artists featured in it." The silence that followed was deafening. Bruno's face faltered for the first time, his smirk disappearing as the reality of Ruth's words sank in. The confidence he had wielded like a weapon crumbled, replaced by confusion, and maybe even a hint of embarrassment. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The onlookers, too, shifted uncomfortably, their expressions transforming from passive curiosity to shame as they realized the gravity of what had just unfolded. At that moment, the gallery's grand entrance became a stage, a battleground for justice, where Ruth stood at the center, unshaken and dignified. She was no longer just a visitor trying to enjoy a peaceful afternoon. She was a woman standing up for her right to exist in a space she had helped create. Ruth halted abruptly, her breath catching as she faced the unexpected obstacle before her. Bruno's imposing figure, standing like a barrier between her and the gallery door, was enough to stir unease. She glanced up at him, her gaze flickering between curiosity and rising apprehension, trying to decipher the reason behind his presence. His cold, piercing blue eyes locked onto hers, unwavering and uninviting, his expression stiff and unfeeling. Ruth's heart tightened as she quickly glanced toward the entrance, watching as other visitors strolled casually inside, bags in hand, untouched by scrutiny. Why was she being singled out? Bruno, tall and broad, with pale skin and perfectly combed blonde hair, pointed wordlessly at Ruth's bag, his gesture sharp and impatient. The unspoken command sent a wave of confusion through her. She stood there, frozen for a moment, trying to make sense of the situation. Her eyes darted to the other guests, observing how they were freely walking into the gallery with their belongings, completely unbothered by the man now blocking her way. Her brow furrowed in disbelief, the weight of injustice settling into her chest. Why was this happening to her? And why now? Bruno's gaze remained hard, his finger once again jabbing at her bag, this time more forceful, more insistent. Ruth could feel her pulse quickening. This was no ordinary request. She took a deep breath, summoning the strength she had always relied upon in moments of unfairness. But still, a quiet frustration was bubbling just beneath the surface, mingling with a sense of humiliation she couldn't quite push away. "Why do I have to hand over my bag?" Ruth finally asked, her voice steady yet laden with the weight of perplexity. She wasn't one to cause a scene, but she also couldn't stay silent when faced with such blatant discrimination. Her question hung in the air, thick with the tension of a situation that felt far more loaded than a simple gallery policy. Bruno's silence stretched on for a beat too long, his face devoid of any sign of empathy or understanding. He was calculating, weighing his response as if he held some power over her that needed careful handling. Finally, his voice, as impersonal and cold as his expression, sliced through the thickening tension. "It's gallery policy, Mom. If you want to enter, you'll need to hand over your bag." Ruth's heart clenched, and her stomach twisted with anger. Her eyes flickered toward the other visitors once again, who continued to enter freely, untouched by this so-called policy. The injustice was glaring. She was being treated differently, there was no mistaking it. The sting of discrimination pierced her, sharp and undeniable. Yet, as she studied Bruno's rigid, unbending stance, she knew arguing would only be met with resistance. His expression told her all she needed to know: this man had no intention of backing down or acknowledging the inequality of the moment. Ruth felt a sense of helplessness wash over her, a familiar feeling that she had fought against her entire life. But with it came a slow, burning resolve. She wasn't powerless, she wouldn't let this pass quietly. Even if this battle was one she'd have to fight differently. With a heavy sigh, filled with the weight of 100 unspoken words, Ruth unclasped her bag from her shoulder and extended it toward Bruno, her fingers trembling slightly as she handed it over. "I hope this doesn't happen to anyone else," Ruth said quietly, her voice tight with barely contained frustration. She held her head high, refusing to let the sting of the moment define her. She would not let him see the hurt he had caused. Bruno took the bag with robotic indifference, his face betraying no emotion, no recognition of the injustice he had just enacted. To him, it was simply another transaction, another rule enforced, devoid of any human element. Ruth's words fell on deaf ears, and the tension in the air only thickened as she stepped past him and through the gallery doors. The small victory in his hands did nothing to ease the weight in her heart. As she crossed the threshold into the floor's gallery, Ruth felt the bitter taste of the encounter still lingering in her mouth. It clung to her, an unwelcome companion that threatened to taint what was supposed to be a peaceful, beautiful experience. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to focus on the art, to shake off the ugliness of what had just happened. She had been looking forward to this visit all week, and she refused to let one man's prejudice rob her of that joy. If you're still tuned into this video and find the story inspiring, drop a 2 in the comments to let me know you're still with me. But as she entered the grand main hall, the bitterness began to fade, if only slightly. The space was breathtaking, a sprawling, open room with high ceilings that seemed to reach for the heavens. Natural light flooded in through massive windows, illuminating the walls adorned with an impressive array of vibrant paintings and sculptures. Every piece seemed to tell a story, every brushstroke a whisper of emotion, of life captured in stillness. The very air seemed to hum with creativity, inviting her to immerse herself in this world of beauty and expression. Ruth paused for a moment, standing still in the center of the room, allowing herself to breathe deeply, to let the art take hold of her. She wanted to be present in this moment, to reclaim the peace she had been seeking. Yet the sting of Bruno's treatment lingered, like a shadow at the edge of her consciousness. It gnawed at her, a reminder that even in a place meant to celebrate human expression and creativity, the ugliness of discrimination could still rear its head. As she began to move slowly from one artwork to the next, Ruth couldn't shake the feeling that this experience, this moment of injustice, was not something she could simply forget. There was a heaviness in her chest, a growing understanding that this was not just about her day being disrupted, it was about something larger, something deeper. She knew this feeling well. The feeling of being judged, of being seen as less than because of the color of her skin. But today, she wasn't just a visitor. She was an artist, someone whose work was part of the very exhibition she had been denied entry to without explanation. The irony wasn't lost on her. How could someone create art that speaks to the human experience, only to have their humanity questioned the moment they stepped through the door? Ruth felt a surge of determination rising within her. This was not the end of the story. She would not let this moment define her, nor would she let it go unnoticed. Inside the gallery, amidst the beauty and the calm, she felt a fire igniting within her, a fire that had been sparked by Bruno's unjust actions and fueled by the silence of those who had stood by and watched. What had started as a simple visit to appreciate art had become something far more profound. This was about justice. This was about dignity. And Ruth, with her heart full of strength and her mind sharp with purpose, knew that this day would be a turning point. She wouldn't let Bruno's cold indifference define her experience. Instead, she would use it to fuel her fight for equality, for herself, and for others who had faced the same prejudice. As Ruth moved deeper into the gallery, her heart began to lighten. She was not defeated. She was merely at the beginning of a new chapter, one where her voice would be heard and where the injustice she had faced would be exposed for what it was. What awaited her inside this space of creativity and beauty was yet to be discovered. But she knew one thing for sure. The story of Ruth would not end with a security guard and an unjustified demand for her bag. It was only just beginning. As Ruth slowly wandered through the hall, attempting to calm the storm of emotions brewing inside her, she couldn't help but let her eyes drift to the other visitors around her. Everywhere she looked, there was ease, laughter, and carefree energy that contrasted sharply with the heavy frustration weighing her down. A young couple stood nearby, chatting animatedly while holding a glossy exhibition brochure, their faces lit up with excitement. They were entirely immersed in their conversation, pointing occasionally at the paintings, oblivious to the tension that had gripped Ruth just moments earlier. Further ahead, an elderly woman, dressed in a flamboyant ensemble topped with an extravagant hat, stood utterly captivated by a large abstract painting. Her wrinkled hand held her chin thoughtfully as she absorbed the artwork, lost in her world. Just next to her, a group of teenagers huddled together, giggling and taking selfies, clearly having a good time as they played around, snapping pictures without care. Ruth's eyes narrowed as she noticed something else. None of them, not a single one, had been stopped or questioned. They all walked freely, unencumbered by security checks, carrying their bags and backpacks without worry. The injustice of it all hit Ruth like a punch in the gut. The realization settled in her stomach like a heavy stone, twisting it with unease. She had been the only one targeted, the only one scrutinized. And for what? Her attention was caught by a middle-aged man, his salt and pepper hair peeking from beneath a well-worn baseball cap. He strolled casually into the gallery, a large, bulky bag slung over his shoulder. Ruth watched intently as he approached Bruno, ready to see if he too would be asked to hand over his belongings. But instead, the man waved at Bruno with a friendly nod, and Bruno, who had been so cold and dismissive toward Ruth, responded with an easy smile and a welcoming gesture. There was no mention of the man's bag, no stern commands or scrutinizing glances. Ruth's frown deepened. Her chest tightened with frustration. Why had her bag, identical in function if not style, been seen as a threat? Her gaze shifted again, this time landing on a young blonde woman with a bright, colorful backpack slung over both shoulders. She breezed past Bruno, laughing with her friend, completely unaware of the preferential treatment she had just received. Bruno didn't even glance in her direction. The sharp contrast between the carefree ease of the other visitors and the humiliation Ruth had experienced sent a wave of sadness crashing through her. Beneath that sadness, though, was a flicker of anger, hot and insistent, rising with every new observation. The evidence was undeniable. Ruth had been singled out and treated differently, and it didn't take much to understand why. In the sea of predominantly white faces, Ruth's rich brown skin made her stand out, and in that moment she couldn't shake the painful realization that she had likely been targeted because of it. The idea that Bruno had seen her as suspicious solely because of her race was a heavy weight to bear, but the fact screamed at her, making it impossible to ignore. She watched Bruno for a moment, her mind racing with conflicting thoughts. Was this deliberate? Did he stop her because she was black? Or was it a coincidence wrapped in layers of unconscious bias? Either way, the result was the same. Ruth felt singled out, marked, and unfairly judged. The injustice of it gnawed at her, leaving her with a simmering discomfort that refused to fade. Despite her best efforts to push it aside, the frustration of being unfairly targeted lingered like a shadow, refusing to let her fully enjoy the art she had come to see. Each painting, no matter how beautiful, was tainted by the memory of that unjust encounter. It was as though Bruno's gaze still followed her, a constant reminder that she was different, that she had been deemed suspicious for reasons beyond her control. Ruth could feel the tension coiling in her chest, and she knew she couldn't let this go without addressing it. She had always believed in standing up for herself, and this moment was no different. She wouldn't allow herself to be silenced by fear or discomfort. Taking a deep breath, her heart pounding with a mix of anxiety and determination, Ruth decided to confront Bruno again. She needed answers. She needed to understand why, in a room full of people, she had been the only one stopped and humiliated. As she approached Bruno, her steps steady but purposeful, her pulse quickened. Bruno remained stationed near the entrance, his cold blue eyes scanning the crowd, as though he were always waiting for the next person to monitor. Ruth stopped a few paces away from him, her stomach churning with a mixture of anger and nerves. She took another deep breath, steadying herself before speaking. "Excuse me, sir," Ruth called out, her voice calm but firm. She refused to let the tremor of frustration creep into her tone. "I need to understand something." Bruno's gaze shifted to her, his expression impassive and unreadable. He had anticipated her return, but his face gave nothing away. Ruth pressed on. "Why was I asked to hand over my bag when no one else seemed to be stopped? I've been watching, and it's clear that other visitors are walking in with similar bags, but no one else has been asked to hand theirs over." Her voice, though measured, carried a weight of incredulity and defiance. She wasn't simply asking, she was demanding an explanation. Bruno's face remained as impassive as ever. He maintained the same rigid posture, his expression cold, as though he were merely performing a routine task. "It's the gallery policy," he repeated, his tone mechanical as if rehearsed 1,000 times over. "Anyone entering with a bulky bag needs to leave it at the entrance. It's a matter of security." Ruth clenched her jaw. The answer was as unsatisfactory as she had expected. She could feel the frustration bubbling to the surface again, her pulse quickening. "And yet," she said, her voice firm, "I've seen several people enter with large bags. None of them were stopped. None of them were questioned." Bruno's gaze didn't waver, but there was a flicker of something, perhaps discomfort, behind his eyes. "It's not personal, Mom," he said curtly. "We do this for everyone's safety." Ruth shook her head. Her disappointment was evident. "It feels personal," she replied, her voice quieter now but filled with emotion. She turned and walked away, leaving Bruno standing in silence, the heavy burden of injustice still resting on her shoulders. "But I've seen several people entering with bags and backpacks," Ruth said, her voice growing firmer as she gestured toward the visitors milling about freely in the gallery. "Why did this only apply to me? My bag isn't any bigger or bulkier than theirs." Bruno's face remained impassive, his cold expression a wall Ruth couldn't penetrate. I'm just doing my duty. Not everyone is checked, but today I need to follow this procedure with you. It might be random, it might not be, but it's the policy, and I can't make exceptions." His words were mechanical, as if rehearsed, devoid of any empathy or understanding of what Ruth was truly asking. Ruth's frustration surged. His explanation made no sense, a hollow justification. "So you're telling me I was randomly chosen without any specific reason?" She pressed, fighting to keep her voice steady, though the tremor of emotion had already slipped in. She felt her anger and sadness intertwining, coiling tightly in her chest. Bruno's response was blunt, devoid of compassion. "It's not up to me to discuss the gallery policy," he repeated, his tone unyielding. "My job is to make sure it's enforced. If you have a complaint, you can take it up with management." His words were a wall, a barrier that Ruth knew wouldn't budge. "This is ridiculous," Ruth muttered under her breath, more to herself than to Bruno. The injustice of it all was suffocating, making her feel small and powerless. The indifferent way Bruno responded to her plight only fueled her anger. She glanced again at the other visitors, who strolled through the gallery carefree and unbothered. None of them had been subjected to the scrutiny she had endured. It was as if Bruno were hiding behind a policy to mask a deeper, uglier truth. It became clear to Ruth that this was more than just following rules. The gnawing suspicion she had been targeted for something she couldn't control, her race gripped her heart tightly. But what could she do at that moment? She knew arguing with Bruno wouldn't change the outcome. For now, she had no choice but to continue with her visit. But her resolve grew stronger. She was determined to get answers, determined not to let this injustice go unnoticed. With a heavy heart, Ruth walked further into the gallery. The art surrounding her, which should have brought peace and inspiration, now seemed tainted by the experience at the entrance. She tried to immerse herself in the vibrant paintings and sculptures, but Bruno's cold stare lingered in her mind like a shadow, an uncomfortable presence that followed her wherever she went. It was impossible to escape the burning sensation of unfairness that now clouded her day. As she wandered through the exhibits, her thoughts drifted to past encounters with prejudice, moments that had left lasting scars. She remembered the time she was followed in a clothing store, the salesperson's eyes glued to her every move, as if waiting for her to steal something. She thought about her school days, where insensitive jokes about her skin color had been tossed around casually, leaving her feeling alienated in a space that should have been safe. These memories resurfaced, painful and raw, mixing with the fresh wound Bruno had inflicted upon her dignity. Ruth stopped in front of a large abstract painting, but her attention was far from the intricate swirls of color and form on the canvas. The rage and sorrow inside her churned, fighting for dominance. She felt a growing urge to shout, to demand that anyone acknowledge what she had been through. She wanted the visitors around her, so blissfully unaware, to understand the weight of the humiliation she had endured. It wasn't just about a bag. It was about being seen as less, about having to constantly prove her right to belong. But along with the anger came a deep, aching sadness. Ruth had long since accepted that racism could appear anywhere, even in places of refinement like an art gallery where beauty and intellect were supposed to reign supreme. She had hoped for an afternoon of peace, but instead she was reminded that no space was truly free from the ugliness of prejudice. It lingered, lurking in the shadows, ready to strike when least expected. She scanned the gallery again, searching for a friendly face, someone who might offer a look of solidarity or understanding. But all she saw were oblivious smiles and casual conversations. No one around her seemed to notice her pain. No one seemed to care. Ruth felt a sharp pang of isolation, as if she were drifting alone in a sea of indifference. But even as sadness threatened to overwhelm her, something else stirred within determination. Ruth had faced challenges her entire life. She had been through storms far more vicious than this, and she had come out stronger each time. This too would pass. She would not let one man's ignorance and bias define her or ruin the strength she had cultivated over the years. There was a fire inside her, a flame of resilience that refused to be extinguished by injustice. Taking a deep, steadying breath, Ruth straightened her posture. She would reclaim her day, her peace. She had come here in search of beauty and inspiration, and she wasn't going to let the actions of one narrow-minded individual rob her of that. This moment, while painful, would not break her. Instead, it would fuel her to keep pushing, to keep demanding the respect and equality she deserved. As she continued through the gallery, Ruth focused on the art, trying to let its beauty wash over her. The injustice still sat heavily on her shoulders, but she carried it with dignity. She knew that in time she would speak up, not just for herself, but for anyone who had ever been made to feel lesser. And when that time came, she would confront this battle with the same grace and strength that had carried her through so many others. For now, though, she would find her solace in the art, refusing to let the world strip away the peace she had come seeking. Ruth was more than the sum of her struggles, more than the moments of injustice that tried to diminish her. She was a warrior, a woman of strength, and this moment, like all the others, would only make her stronger. Ruth stood in place for a moment, the tension settling over her like a thick, heavy fog. She had hoped that handing over her bag would allow her a chance to enjoy the gallery without further incident, but the weight of Bruno's cold, watchful presence remained, pressing on her shoulders like an unwelcome burden. She took a deep breath, her chest rising and falling with a slow, deliberate rhythm, willing herself to focus on the art and find a pocket of peace amidst the disquiet. Her goal was simple: to absorb the beauty of the pieces before her and leave the frustration behind, at least for a little while. If you're still tuned into this video and find the story inspiring, drop a 3 in the comments to let me know you're still with me. The gallery itself was stunning. The walls were adorned with an eclectic array of contemporary paintings and sculptures, each one more arresting than the last. Ruth paused in front of a massive abstract painting that immediately caught her eye. Its vibrant, swirling colors seemed to pulse with life, the chaotic brushstrokes pulling her into a world of emotion. The shades of red, orange, and blue danced together in a way that mirrored her turbulent feelings. In that moment, Ruth felt a deep connection to the artwork, as though it understood the very turmoil swirling inside her. As her eyes roamed across the canvas, she lost herself in the interplay of colors, feeling the tension in her body begin to ease, if only for a moment. Art had always been her sanctuary, a way to process her inner world, and this piece was no different. The painting seemed to reflect her struggle, chaos and beauty, frustration and hope, all entwined in a complex dance. Ruth allowed herself to be consumed by it, letting the vibrant imagery wash over her and offer a fleeting sense of relief. Moving further into the gallery, Ruth's attention was drawn to an elegant marble sculpture in the corner. The figure was of a woman, arms outstretched, poised as if on the verge of flight. There was a lightness, an ethereal quality to the sculpture that contrasted with the heavy material from which it had been crafted. Ruth marveled at the skill of the artist, who had managed to capture such grace in stone. The expression on the woman's face was serene and peaceful, as though she had found her freedom, her release from the weight of the world. Ruth felt a pang of longing as she admired the sculpture. It embodied the very thing she craved: freedom, not just from Bruno's oppressive watch, but from the deeper struggle she had faced all her life. She stood there for a long moment, contemplating what freedom truly meant to her, and how she could find it in a world so often bent on withholding it from people like her. But the brief moments of solace were soon shattered. Ruth could feel it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. Bruno's presence, a dark cloud that had been lingering at the edge of her awareness, now pressed in more forcefully. She turned her head slightly, just enough to confirm what she already knew. There he was, standing a few meters away, his piercing blue eyes locked on her like a predator tracking its prey. His rigid posture, his firm steps as he moved closer whenever she tried to distance herself, made her feel suffocated. Ruth could sense that no matter where she went, Bruno was right behind her, silently waiting, as if expecting her to make a mistake. Her heart pounded in her chest, frustration and discomfort surging through her veins. She tried to focus on the art, to recapture the peace she had come here for. But it was impossible to ignore Bruno's unyielding gaze. He was too close, his presence too heavy. The gallery, once a space of calm and beauty, now felt like a prison. Ruth's every movement was being monitored and scrutinized, as if she were a threat rather than a visitor, a woman simply trying to enjoy an afternoon surrounded by creativity. Other visitors began to notice the tension. A young couple standing nearby glanced at Bruno with puzzled expressions. One of them whispered something to the other, casting furtive looks in Ruth's direction, clearly wondering what was going on. Further down the hall, the group of teenagers who had been laughing and carefree earlier now looked uneasy. One of them glanced at Ruth, then back at Bruno, confusion and curiosity written on his face. It was clear they were picking up on the strange dynamic, though none of them dared to intervene. Ruth's frustration intensified. She tried to shake off the sensation of being hunted, tried to move to a different section of the gallery to distance herself from Bruno's relentless pursuit. But he followed, always a few steps behind. His presence was like a heavy shadow, impossible to escape. The more she tried to lose herself in the art, the more claustrophobic she felt, trapped in a space that should have offered her freedom. Every brushstroke, every sculpture, every piece of art that should have spoken to her was drowned out by the reality of what was happening. It wasn't just Bruno's gaze that was following her, it was the oppressive force of systemic discrimination, a weight she had carried her entire life. The other visitors could move freely, unbothered by watchful eyes, unburdened by assumptions. But for Ruth, this space had become hostile, a reflection of the larger world that continued to question her right to exist without scrutiny. Her chest tightened as the suffocating sensation grew. She had hoped that by confronting Bruno, by handing over her bag, she could diffuse the situation and move on. But the reality was far more complicated. She hadn't just handed over her bag, she had handed over a piece of her dignity, and Bruno's relentless watch was a reminder that it hadn't been enough. Nothing would ever be enough. Ruth wanted to scream, to shout, to demand that Bruno explain why she was being treated this way, why she was being followed and monitored like a criminal. But she knew the futility of such an outburst. She had seen it before: the disbelief, the dismissal, the way people like Bruno would turn it back on her, painting her as the aggressor for simply standing up for herself. Instead, she took a deep breath, trying to compose herself. She wasn't going to let him win, wasn't going to let this experience completely ruin her day. Ruth had fought too many battles to be defeated by one man's prejudice. She had come here to find beauty, and she would find it even if it meant carrying the weight of injustice along with her. With a final glance at the marble sculpture, Ruth moved forward, determined to reclaim what little peace she could. But no matter how far she walked, Bruno's eyes remained fixed on her, an ever-present reminder of the fight she would always have to endure. Ruth stood in front of the serene landscape painting, her eyes tracing the delicate lines of the trees and the soft hues of the sky. But her mind was no longer in the world of art. Bruno's looming presence behind her cast a shadow over everything, making it impossible to immerse herself in the peace she so desperately sought. What should have been a moment of tranquility had become an unbearable experience, tainted by the weight of suspicion hanging in the air. Every nerve in her body felt frayed, and the pressure of being under constant surveillance had become too much to bear. With a steadying breath, Ruth turned slowly toward Bruno, trying to summon calm in the face of her growing frustration. Her heart pounded as she locked eyes with him, determined to confront the situation head-on. "Sir, is there something wrong?" she asked, her voice firm but controlled, a quiet strength underlying her words. She refused to let her frustration crack through, though it simmered just beneath the surface. Bruno's expression remained unmoved. "I'm just ensuring the gallery's security, ma'am. I need to make sure everything is in order," he replied, his tone mechanical, as if he were reading from a script. Ruth's eyes narrowed slightly. "In order? I'm just appreciating the art, like everyone else. Why do you keep following me?" Bruno's response was immediate and cold, as he stepped closer, shrinking the space between them. "I need to make sure there's nothing suspicious. It's my job." His voice was flat and emotionless, but the implication behind his words hung in the air like a heavy fog. Ruth felt her heart sink, a knot of concern twisting in her stomach. The insinuation was clear he was treating her as if she were a threat. She had done nothing wrong, yet she was being followed, monitored, and treated as though her presence in the gallery was somehow dangerous. It was an all too familiar feeling, one she had faced many times before, but that didn't make it any easier to swallow. "I'm not doing anything wrong," Ruth said, her voice trembling slightly as she fought to keep her composure. "I'm here to see the exhibition, just like everyone else. Why did you choose to follow me?" Bruno crossed his arms, his posture rigid, his eyes unyielding. "Mom, it's my responsibility to ensure the gallery's security. If you have nothing to hide, you shouldn't be concerned." The thinly veiled accusation in his words ignited a flare of anger deep within Ruth. He was implying that she had something to hide, that her mere presence was suspicious. The unfairness of it all was suffocating, yet Ruth knew she had to stay composed. She had seen this before, how quickly things could escalate if she let her anger show. She took a deep breath, her chest tightening with the weight of holding it all in. "I'm not hiding anything," she said, her voice steady but laced with indignation. "And there's no reason for you to treat me as if I'm a criminal. I'm here to see the art, and that's exactly what I'm doing." Bruno's face remained impassive, his cold blue eyes fixed on her without a hint of empathy. "If you're not doing anything wrong, there's no reason to worry about my presence," he said, his tone condescending, as though he believed he was in the right simply because of his role. Ruth clenched her fists at her sides, her frustration boiling over. She was speaking to a brick wall, each word bouncing back at her with no effect. Bruno's intransigence was infuriating, his refusal to acknowledge her humanity or the unfairness of the situation only fueling her anger. She looked around, noticing other visitors casting curious glances in their direction. Some were whispering, their eyes darting between Ruth and Bruno, trying to piece together what was happening. The weight of injustice pressed down on Ruth's shoulders, threatening to break through her calm exterior. She knew that continuing to argue with Bruno would likely change nothing. His mind was made up, and his assumptions about her weren't going to shift because of a conversation. But the sting of being treated this way, simply for existing in the space, was a deep cut that she couldn't easily ignore. It was a wound she had carried for years, one that was reopened time and time again by moments like this. Taking a deep breath, Ruth made a decision. She wasn't going to let this man strip her of her dignity, no matter how he treated her. She was better than that, stronger than the small-mindedness he represented. "I'm going to continue my visit," she said finally, her voice firm and steady, her words carrying the weight of her resolve. "I hope you find someone else to follow." With that, Ruth turned, walking away from Bruno, her back straight and her head held high. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her crumble. As she moved through the gallery, trying to refocus on the art, she knew the weight of his gaze would continue to follow her, but she refused to let it define her experience. She had come here to find beauty and peace, and even though that peace had been shattered, she would reclaim what she could. Bruno's presence might continue to haunt her, but Ruth had faced worse. She had survived far more painful experiences, and this would be no different. She would leave the gallery with her head held high, knowing that she hadn't let prejudice and discrimination break her spirit. Ruth stood frozen in disbelief, Bruno's words hanging in the air like a cruel joke, but there was no humor to be found in the sharp accusation. Her body trembled with a mix of rage and heartbreak as she processed what he had said. Steal. How could he even think such a thing? The humiliation of being accused, the audacity of it, weighed down on her like a crushing boulder. Still, Ruth repeated, her voice barely above a whisper, as she tried to comprehend the gravity of the situation. She took a breath, fighting to maintain her composure. You must be joking. I haven't even touched anything. All I've done is look at the art, like everyone else here. Bruno stood firm, his stern expression unchanging, as if every word Ruth said only reinforced his unfounded belief. I've seen you moving suspiciously near the artworks, he insisted, his tone filled with cold certainty. We need to ensure your intentions are honest. You need to come with me. A wave of anger surged through Ruth, her pulse quickening as she struggled to hold back the words that wanted to spill out. How could he, without any proof, without any valid reason, accuse her of something so outrageous? The sting of injustice burned deep in her chest. She had done nothing wrong, and yet she was being treated like a criminal simply for existing in this space. She could feel the eyes of the other visitors on her again, the same uncomfortable stares, but this time they were tinged with something else: suspicion. People whispered among themselves, their glances darting between Ruth and Bruno, and she could see the curiosity, the unease spreading like wildfire. The weight of their silent judgments pressed down on her, intensifying the sense of isolation she had been trying to escape all afternoon. Ruth felt trapped, like the walls of the gallery were closing in on her. The serene environment she had sought refuge in had turned hostile, and there was no way out without being further humiliated. Bruno had painted her as a suspect, and no amount of reasoning seemed to break through his rigid stance. The other visitors were watching, not intervening, not questioning his actions. She was alone in this, standing in the middle of a storm she hadn't created, but one she was being swept into. I am not a thief, Ruth said, her voice trembling with controlled anger. She tried to keep it steady, but the frustration bled through. I came here to enjoy the art, not to be followed, harassed, and accused of things I haven't done. You are being deeply unfair to me. But Bruno's face remained unreadable, and his cold, authoritative demeanor only made her words feel more futile. If you've done nothing wrong, you have nothing to fear, he said, repeating the same patronizing line as before. But I need to follow through with our protocol. Ruth's patience finally snapped. Your protocol? Your protocol seems to involve harassing people based on nothing but your assumptions. I'm here, just like everyone else, minding my own business, and yet I'm the one being targeted. The sharpness in Ruth's voice caused a few more heads to turn, and now, even more, people were watching, but their silence still hung heavy, like they were waiting for something to unfold but unwilling to step in. Bruno took a step closer, towering over her, his voice low but unyielding. You can either cooperate, Mom, or we'll have to involve law enforcement. Ruth's heart pounded in her chest. The implication of his words hit her like a blow to the stomach. He wasn't just accusing her of theft, he was threatening to escalate it, to bring in the police, to further humiliate and degrade her based on nothing but his own biases and suspicions. It was too much. And the anger, the sadness, the frustration of a lifetime of being unjustly scrutinized because of her race boiled over. She clenched her fists, willing herself to stay calm, to keep her dignity even as Bruno attempted to strip it from her. She looked him dead in the eye, refusing to let him see her break. I am not going anywhere with you, she said firmly. I have done nothing wrong, and you have no right to treat me this way. If you want to involve the police, then go ahead. But I'm not letting you bully me into submission. For a brief moment there was silence, a tension so thick it felt like the entire gallery had stopped to watch. Ruth's defiance was met with a cold, unblinking stare from Bruno, but she didn't flinch. She had fought battles like this her whole life, and she wasn't going to let this moment define her. If you're still tuned into this video and find the story inspiring, drop a 4 in the comments to let me know you're still with me. Suddenly, a voice broke the tension. One of the gallery staff, a young woman with curly hair and a soft, concerned expression, stepped forward. "Excuse me," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "I'm sorry, but what's going on here?" Ruth felt a flicker of hope as the woman turned to her with genuine concern in her eyes. "I don't know," Ruth said, her voice still laced with frustration. "I've done nothing wrong, and this man keeps following me, accusing me of suspicious behavior and now theft. I'm just here to see the art, but he's treating me like a criminal." The young woman looked at Bruno, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. "Bruno, we can't just accuse someone without evidence," she said gently but firmly. "If there's no proof of wrongdoing, we can't continue to harass our visitors. Please, let her enjoy her visit." For the first time, Bruno hesitated. He looked at the staff member, then back at Ruth, the tension in his rigid posture loosening ever so slightly. "I'm just doing my job," he muttered, though the authority in his voice seemed diminished. Ruth, still shaking with anger but grateful for the intervention, watched as Bruno finally stepped back, his eyes narrowing slightly before he turned away. The young woman offered Ruth an apologetic smile. "I'm so sorry for what happened. Please, if you need anything, let me know." Ruth nodded, her heart still racing, but the small gesture of support made her feel less alone in that moment. As Bruno disappeared into the background, Ruth took a deep breath, knowing that while the situation had de-escalated, the damage had already been done. The weight of injustice still clung to her, but she had stood her ground, and that, at least, was something. As she turned back toward the art, Ruth knew this visit to the gallery would never be what she had hoped for, but she had reclaimed a piece of herself. Ruth followed Renata through the gallery's main hall, her heart still pounding with frustration and indignation, but a sense of relief began to slowly creep in. Finally, she was going to have the chance to explain herself to someone who might understand the gravity of the situation. Renata's calm authority was a stark contrast to Bruno's hostile suspicion, and Ruth felt a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, this ordeal would come to a fair resolution. As they reached a quiet, private corner of the gallery, away from the curious eyes of other visitors, Renata gestured toward a small seating area. "Please, sit down," she said gently, her voice filled with professionalism but also a hint of compassion. Ruth appreciated the gesture, though her nerves were still raw from the series of events that had brought her here. Bruno stood to the side, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable but still full of that same cold detachment that had marked every interaction. Ruth couldn't help but feel his presence weighing on her, a reminder of the unfair treatment she had endured. She took a seat, her back straight, refusing to let the humiliation bend her spirit. "Ruth," Renata began, sitting across from her, "I want to understand exactly what happened. Please tell me everything from the moment you entered the gallery." Ruth took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. "From the moment I arrived, I felt singled out," she started, her voice steady but laced with emotion. "Bruno stopped me and asked for my bag, even though I saw other people entering freely with their bags and backpacks. I handed it over without complaint. But then he started following me. Everywhere I went, he was there, watching me. I tried to ignore it, but it became unbearable." Ruth paused, her eyes meeting Renata's, who was listening intently, her expression sympathetic but professional. "And then," Ruth continued, "Bruno accused me of behaving suspiciously. He even implied I was attempting to steal something. I've done nothing but look at the art, and yet I've been treated like a criminal. I feel like this is happening because of who I am, not because of anything I've done." Renata nodded thoughtfully, glancing briefly at Bruno, who stood rigid and silent. She turned back to Ruth. "I understand how this situation could be extremely upsetting," she said, her tone measured. "Our security team is tasked with ensuring the safety of the gallery and its visitors, but it's clear that something has gone wrong here. You should not have been made to feel uncomfortable or targeted." Bruno shifted slightly as if preparing to speak, but Renata held up a hand, silencing him. "Bruno, I'll speak with you in a moment." Ruth felt a small wave of validation wash over her, but it wasn't enough to fully ease the tension. "It's not just about feeling uncomfortable," Ruth added, her voice firm. "It's about being treated differently, unfairly, without any basis. I've done nothing wrong, but I've been followed and accused as if I'm guilty of something just for being here." Renata sighed, her face softening as she acknowledged the deeper implications of Ruth's words. "I hear you, and I sincerely apologize for the way you've been treated. It's unacceptable, and we will address it. Please know that this is not how we want any of our guests to experience the gallery." Ruth appreciated Renata's words, but the sting of the experience remained. "I need more than an apology," she said quietly but firmly. "I need to know that something will be done, that this won't happen to me or anyone else again." Renata nodded, clearly understanding Ruth's determination. "You're right, and I will personally make sure we review our security protocols to prevent this kind of situation from happening again." She glanced at Bruno, who stood stiffly, his face tight with frustration. "Bruno, I will speak with you in detail about this, but for now, I want you to return to your post and leave this matter to me." Bruno hesitated for a moment, his pride clearly stung, but after a brief silence, he nodded and walked away, leaving Ruth and Renata alone. Once Bruno was gone, Renata turned back to Ruth, her expression softer. "I truly regret that your visit has been overshadowed by this. Please, let me offer you a private tour of the gallery as a gesture of goodwill. I want to make sure you leave here with the experience you came for." Ruth considered the offer for a moment. Part of her wanted to walk away, to leave this place behind with all its bitterness and anger. But another part of her wanted to reclaim the peace she had sought in the first place. After all, she had come to see the art, to find beauty and inspiration, and she wasn't about to let one person's prejudice rob her of that. "Thank you," Ruth said finally, her voice a bit softer now. "I appreciate that." Renata smiled gently and stood up. "Let's start over. Then, I'll personally show you some of our most prized pieces." As they walked through the gallery together, Ruth felt the tension in her body slowly ease, though the weight of the injustice she had experienced still lingered. It would take time to fully process everything that had happened, but for now, she took comfort in the fact that she had stood up for herself, demanded accountability, and found a small measure of justice. She hadn't let the experience break her spirit. Instead, she had risen above it. As Renata guided her through the beautiful exhibitions, Ruth allowed herself, for the first time that day, to fully absorb the art, to lose herself in the colors, the stories, and the creativity she had come to admire. And in that, at least she found some measure of peace. The tension in the small room thickened as Charles entered, his imposing presence making the already strained atmosphere even heavier. Ruth, sitting upright in the leather chair, felt another wave of frustration wash over her. She had hoped for support, but now, with yet another figure of authority entering the room, it seemed like the weight of suspicion was closing in even tighter. She tried to remain composed, her hands clasped together in her lap to stop their trembling. The humiliation of being accused followed, and now subjected to a search gnawed at her, but she was determined not to let this break her spirit. Renata, clearly relieved by Charles's arrival, stood up and motioned for him to join them. "Charles, thank you for coming. There's been some concern regarding one of our guests, and we need your assistance in conducting a standard security check." Ruth's heart sank. The term standard felt like a cruel euphemism for what was happening, a justification for singling her out and treating her like a criminal without cause. She looked up at Charles, hoping he might bring a more reasonable perspective to the situation, but his expression remained unreadable, his attention shifting between Bruno, Renata, and Ruth. "Is that so?" Charles said, his voice calm but firm. He turned to Ruth, his brown eyes meeting hers. "Ma'am, I understand this is uncomfortable, but we're just trying to follow protocol. If you cooperate, this can be resolved quickly." Ruth couldn't contain her frustration any longer. She stood up, her voice shaking but filled with determination. "Protocol? Protocol is meant to protect everyone, but it's being used here to humiliate and demean me for no reason. I've done nothing wrong. I'm not a threat, yet I've been followed and accused. And now you want to search me. Where is the evidence? Where is the reason for this?" Charles remained silent for a moment, listening. Ruth saw something flicker in his eyes, maybe a glimmer of understanding, but it wasn't enough to stop the inevitable. He took a breath and then addressed both Renata and Bruno. "Have there been any reports of suspicious activity, or is this purely based on observation?" Bruno, standing stiffly, spoke up. "It's based on my observations. She's been moving in a way that suggests she might be trying to interfere with the artwork. I felt it necessary to follow up." Ruth's anger surged again. "Moving in a way that suggested interference," she repeated, incredulous. "I was walking through the gallery, appreciating the art like everyone else. That's not suspicious, it's normal. I have no idea what you're talking about." Charles sighed, clearly trying to manage the situation with some degree of professionalism. "Mom, I understand how you feel, but our goal is to ensure the safety of the artwork. If Bruno felt there was enough concern to escalate this, we need to address it. However," he added, glancing at Bruno, "if this is based on observations alone, we should be very careful about making accusations without evidence." Renata, sensing the growing tension, stepped forward. "Perhaps we can take a step back here. Ruth, I do apologize for how this situation has unfolded. Our goal is never to make any guest feel uncomfortable or singled out. However, in this case, I believe Bruno was trying to do his job, though perhaps there was a misunderstanding. We want to resolve this quickly and fairly." Ruth shook her head, disbelief clouding her thoughts. "A misunderstanding? This isn't just a misunderstanding, this is blatant discrimination. You can't just follow someone around, accuse them, and subject them to a search without any real reason. You've made me feel unwelcome and disrespected from the moment I stepped into this gallery." Charles, seeing the emotion in Ruth's eyes, turned to Bruno with a stern look. "Bruno, did you see any actual interference with the artworks, or was this all based on your perception of her behavior?" Bruno hesitated for the first time. His face tightened as if trying to hold his ground. "I didn't see her touch anything directly," he admitted, though his tone was defensive. "But I believed her movement suggested something could happen." Charles nodded slowly, then turned back to Ruth. "Ma'am, it appears there may not have been a solid basis for the escalation. I'm sorry this has gone as far as it has." Ruth felt a small sense of vindication at hearing Charles's words, but it wasn't enough to erase the humiliation she had already endured. "Sorry isn't enough," she said quietly, but firmly. "I came here to appreciate the art, to find peace, and instead I was treated like a criminal. I want more than an apology. I want to know that this won't happen again to me or anyone else." Charles, clearly trying to handle the situation with care, nodded in agreement. "You're right. This has been mishandled, and for that, I apologize on behalf of the gallery. We will conduct a full review of the incident to ensure it doesn't happen again." Renata, who had remained silent during this exchange, stepped forward. "Ruth, please know that we are deeply regretful of what's happened today. I would like to offer you a complimentary private tour and a special invitation to our next gallery opening as a gesture of goodwill. We don't want your experience to be defined by this unfortunate situation." Ruth considered the offer, her emotions still raw. A part of her wanted to leave and never come back, but another part of her felt the need to reclaim her space in the gallery, to take back her day and not let this experience define her visit. She took a deep breath and said, "I appreciate the gesture, but what I want is accountability. I want to know that the next time someone walks in here, they won't be followed or accused simply because of how they look. That's more important to me than a private tour." Renata nodded, clearly understanding the gravity of Ruth's words. "We will ensure that a full review is done. This gallery is meant to be a space of inclusion and respect for everyone. You have my word that we will address this." Ruth nodded, her emotions still simmering beneath the surface, but there was a small sense of resolution. As she stood to leave, Charles spoke one last time. "Ma'am, again, I'm truly sorry for how this was handled. Please don't hesitate to reach out if you need further support." If you're still tuned into this video and find the story inspiring, drop a 5 in the comments to let me know you're still with me. Ruth looked at him, nodded once, and walked out of the room, her head held high. She hadn't let the injustice break her spirit, but she knew this experience would stay with her. As she stepped back into the main gallery, she resolved that this would be the start of a larger conversation about fairness, about dignity, and about the quiet, everyday battles many people still have to fight. Ruth could feel her pulse quicken as she gathered every ounce of patience she had left. She knew that no matter what she said, Charles had already made up his mind. His calm, rehearsed tone only confirmed that he wasn't truly considering her side of the story. It was as if every word she spoke bounced off an invisible wall, one built by Bruno's baseless accusations and Charles's blind adherence to the end. "Charles," Ruth said, her voice steady but filled with a mix of frustration and exhaustion, "I understand that you had procedures to follow, but what's happening here goes beyond just following rules. I've been targeted, followed, and humiliated without any evidence of wrongdoing. You're putting blind faith in Bruno's judgment without listening to me, without giving me the same consideration." Charles's expression remained unchanged, but Ruth could sense his impatience. He glanced briefly at Bruno, who stood confidently, arms crossed, as though vindicated by the head of security's unwavering support. "I hear what you're saying," Charles replied in the same detached tone, "but we have to prioritize the safety of the gallery. If there's even a suspicion, no matter how small, we are obligated to act on it. It's not personal, it's just procedure." "Not personal," Ruth repeated, her voice rising slightly. "How can you say that when I'm the only one being followed and accused? There are dozens of people here, but I'm the one being treated like a criminal. You've made it personal by choosing to believe Bruno's suspicions over my truth, without any evidence." For the first time, a flicker of discomfort crossed Charles's face, but it was fleeting, gone before Ruth could even fully register it. He glanced at Renata, who had remained silent throughout the entire exchange, her face tight with discomfort. Ruth felt a surge of anger rise within her, anger at how easily they dismissed her, at how quickly they had judged her without truly seeing her. "I'm not resisting your procedures," Ruth continued, her voice shaking slightly now, "but I won't stand here and be treated like a suspect without any reason. I came here to appreciate the art, to find peace, Instead, I've been followed, humiliated, and now accused of theft." Charles nodded, but his body language betrayed him. He had no intention of backing down. "We need to follow through with the check, ma'am. If there's nothing to hide, this will be over quickly." Ruth clenched her fists at her sides, the injustice of the situation weighing heavily on her. She felt trapped, cornered by their refusal to see her as anything more than a potential threat. She knew that no amount of reasoning would get through to them. They had already decided her fate the moment Bruno had voiced his baseless suspicions. "Fine," Ruth said, her voice trembling with emotion. "If this is what it takes to prove my innocence, then go ahead. But know that I will not forget this. You're not just following procedure, you're perpetuating discrimination, and I won't stay silent about it." Renata finally stepped forward, her voice quiet but firm. "Ruth, I'm truly sorry for how this situation has unfolded. This isn't how we want any of our visitors to feel, and I'll make sure this is looked into thoroughly. But for now, let's just get this resolved." Ruth's gaze shifted to Renata, her eyes filled with disappointment. "I expected more from a place that's supposed to celebrate art and creativity. You've allowed this to happen under your watch." Renata's expression faltered, guilt flashing across her face, but she said nothing in response. Instead, she gestured for Charles and Bruno to proceed with their check. Ruth felt the weight of humiliation press down on her as they led her to a more private area for the search. The process was brief, invasive, and utterly degrading. Ruth stood tall, though, her head held high, refusing to let them see her break under the pressure. When it was over, they found nothing, as she had known all along, but the damage had been done. Charles looked at her with a practiced apology. "You're free to go, ma'am." "I'm sorry for the inconvenience." "Inconvenience," Ruth repeated bitterly, her voice laced with sarcasm. "You think that's what this was?" Without waiting for a response, Ruth walked out of the room, her heart heavy but her resolve intact. She wouldn't let them see her cry. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction. As she stepped back into the gallery, the artwork that had once called to her now felt distant, tainted by the ugly reality of what she had just endured. Ruth knew that her visit to the gallery had been ruined, but more than that, she knew that this experience was not an isolated incident. It was part of a larger system of prejudice, where people like her were judged, followed, and suspected for no reason other than the color of their skin. She vowed then and there that she would speak up, that she would tell her story. She would make sure people knew what had happened, that she wouldn't be silenced or dismissed. Ruth walked out of the gallery, her head still held high, her spirit bruised but not broken. This was far from over. She would seek justice in her way. Ruth followed Charles down the narrow corridor, her heart pounding with a mix of frustration, anger, and humiliation. The sterile walls of the gallery seemed to close in on her as they approached the small, private room where the search would take place. Each step felt heavier than the last, and her mind raced with the injustice of it all. She had done nothing wrong, yet here she was, being treated like a criminal, all because of Bruno's baseless suspicions and Charles's blind adherence to protocol. As they entered the room, Ruth's eyes immediately caught her reflection in the large mirror. She could see the tension etched on her face, her jaw tight, her eyes bright with anger and sadness. She didn't want to be here. She didn't want to subject herself to this invasive, humiliating process, but she also knew that resisting would only make things worse. Charles stood by the door, his posture rigid, arms crossed as he gestured for Ruth to take a seat in the cold, empty room. The sterile atmosphere seemed to amplify the weight of the moment, and Ruth could feel the knot in her stomach tighten. She had to remind herself that she was here not because of anything she had done, but because of the prejudice that had led her to this point. "Please take a seat," Charles said, his voice still lacking any warmth or empathy. He watched Ruth with the same unyielding gaze, as though waiting for her to resist. Ruth sat down, her spine straight, refusing to let them see her bow under the pressure. "I want it on record that I am doing this under protest," she repeated firmly. "This is an invasion of my privacy and an abuse of power. I haven't done anything wrong, and you have no reason to treat me like this." Charles nodded as if he had heard it all before. "We understand your position, Mom, but we still need to conduct the check to ensure everything is in order. It's our duty." Ruth clenched her fists in her lap, taking a deep breath to steady herself. "You must protect the gallery, not to humiliate and dehumanize your visitors." Charles didn't respond, and his silence only deepened Ruth's sense of isolation in this moment. She felt like she was on trial, forced to prove her innocence without any cause for suspicion beyond the color of her skin and the assumptions others had made about her. It was a painful reminder of the systemic prejudices she had faced before, but she wasn't about to let this experience define her. As the minutes dragged on, Charles made the call for a female security officer to enter the room and conduct the search. Ruth's heart sank even further as she watched the door open, and a woman in a matching uniform stepped inside, her expression professional but distant. She introduced herself quietly, avoiding Ruth's gaze, as if she, too, knew the uncomfortable reality of the situation but had chosen not to question it. The search was thorough and humiliating, but as expected, it revealed nothing. Ruth hadn't stolen anything, hadn't tampered with any of the artworks, hadn't done anything wrong. The entire ordeal had been for nothing, no justification, no evidence, only suspicion born from prejudice. When it was finally over, Ruth stood up, her body tense but her head held high. "Are we done now?" she asked, her voice sharp with the weight of everything she had just endured. Charles nodded, though his expression remained unyielding. "You're free to go, ma'am." Ruth stared at him for a moment, her mind buzzing with anger and disbelief. "Free to go," she echoed bitterly. "After all this, you think I should just walk out of here as if nothing happened?" Charles said nothing in response. He only stepped aside, opening the door to let Ruth leave. She could feel the weight of his indifference pressing on her like a physical force, but she refused to let it break her. As Ruth stepped out of the room, the gallery seemed impossibly large and cold. The art that had once called to her now felt distant, as though it existed in a different world from the harsh reality she had just experienced. Every brushstroke, every sculpture, every piece of creativity and beauty now felt tainted by the injustice she had faced. But Ruth wasn't about to let them take her dignity. She walked with purpose, her head high, her spirit bruised but not broken. She knew that this experience was part of a much larger battle, one that many people faced every day. But Ruth wasn't going to stay silent. She would seek justice in her way, and she would make sure that her story was heard. As she left the gallery, the echoes of her footsteps fading behind her, Ruth knew that this was far from over. She would hold them accountable, and she would remind them that everyone deserved to be treated with dignity, no matter what preconceived judgments others might have. Ruth's body tensed as Charles continued his search with methodical indifference. Every touch felt like an insult, a reminder of the injustice she was being subjected to. Her thoughts raced as she stared at her reflection in the mirror, seeing the anger and sadness in her own eyes. She was being treated like a common criminal, and it was all based on nothing but suspicion. No proof, no justification, just prejudice. Charles knelt, running his hands along her legs, inspecting her shoes. Ruth clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms as she fought to keep her composure. It felt like an eternity, but she refused to let them see her break. She wouldn't give them that satisfaction. Each humiliating moment burned into her memory, a scar she knew would stay with her for a long time. Finally, after what felt like an endless eternity, Charles stood up. "You're clear," he said flatly, almost as if the outcome disappointed him. He stepped back, his job done, his suspicions unfounded, but no apology followed. He didn't even look her in the eye as he moved away. Ruth slowly turned, her movements deliberate, her dignity intact despite everything. She straightened her clothes and looked Charles directly in the eyes. "I told you I wasn't hiding anything," she said, her voice trembling with the weight of everything she had held back. "You had no right to treat me like this. No reason at all." Charles avoided her gaze, but his expression remained cold, indifferent. "It's just procedure," he mumbled, as though that excused everything. But for Ruth, this wasn't just a matter of procedure. It was about the disrespect, the humiliation, and the deeper injustice she had endured. "Procedure," she repeated, incredulous. "What about my dignity? What about the way I've been treated? You don't even care." Charles remained silent, unmoved, as if her words bounced off him like rain against a stone. Ruth adjusted her coat, lifted her chin, and walked past him. Each step she took was a declaration of her strength, a reminder that no matter what they put her through, she would not be diminished. They could search her, accuse her, and treat her as less than, but they could not strip her of her dignity. As she left the room, the gallery outside felt different. What had once been a space of creativity and beauty now seemed tainted by the ugliness of what she had just experienced. Ruth knew she wasn't the first person to face this kind of injustice, and she certainly wouldn't be the last. But at that moment, she resolved that she would not let this experience define her. Stepping out into the light, Ruth inhaled deeply, reclaiming her space in the world. She had endured their suspicions, their search, their cruelty, but she had come out the other side stronger. This wasn't the end, it was just the beginning of her fight for justice. She would not be silenced. She would not be broken. She would make sure that the world heard her story. Ruth met Renata's confused gaze with a steady look of her own, the anger still simmering beneath her calm exterior. "That was the mayor's office," Ruth said, her voice cool but deliberate. "I've just informed them of what's happening here, and they'll be in touch shortly." Renata blinked, her confusion deepening. Bruno and Charles exchanged nervous glances, the confidence that had bolstered their actions now faltering in the face of Ruth's unexpected connections. Ruth could see the shift in their demeanor, the realization that they had misjudged her, that she wasn't someone they could push around without consequence. Renata cleared her throat, trying to regain some semblance of control. "I see," she said slowly, her tone wavering slightly. "We didn't realize, we didn't know who you were." Ruth's eyes flashed with a mix of frustration and hurt. "It shouldn't matter who I am," she responded, her voice sharp but steady. "I should have been treated with respect from the moment I walked into this gallery, not followed, searched, and humiliated. Your actions were unjust, and now you're scrambling because you think my connections change the situation. But they don't. What matters is how I've been treated." If you're still tuned into this video and find the story inspiring, drop a 6 in the comments to let me know you're still with me. Bruno shifted uncomfortably, his arms crossed defensively as he watched the scene unfold. His once smug expression had hardened into something closer to fear, though his disdain for Ruth still lingered in the air between them. Charles, too, had gone silent, his earlier bravado replaced with uncertainty. Renata's composure continued to crumble under the weight of Ruth's words. She took a step closer, her voice lowering in an attempt to sound conciliatory. "Ruth, I apologize for how this was handled. There's been a misunderstanding and we—" "This wasn't a misunderstanding," Ruth interrupted, her tone fierce. "This was about power, prejudice, and assumptions. You all saw me as a threat the moment I walked in, not because I did anything wrong, but because of what you assumed about me. And now that you know I'm connected to the mayor's office, you want to apologize. That's not good enough." Renata's face paled as the weight of Ruth's accusations sank in. For the first time, she looked genuinely shaken, as if the reality of what had transpired was finally hitting her. "You're right," she whispered, glancing down at the floor. "We've made a terrible mistake." Ruth stood taller, her dignity fully restored despite the pain she had endured. "This isn't just about me," she said, her voice soft but filled with strength. "It's about how you treat everyone who walks through those doors. No one should have to go through what I just did, being searched, humiliated, and disrespected without any cause. You need to reflect on the culture you've created here, because today you've shown your true colors." Renata nodded, her eyes wide with realization. "We'll take immediate action to address this. I swear to you, Ruth, things will change. I'll make sure of it." Ruth regarded her for a moment, sensing the sincerity in Renata's words, but knowing that change would require more than just promises. It would require action, and Ruth intended to make sure that action was taken. "I'll be following up on this," Ruth said firmly, "with the mayor's office and with your management team. What happened today can't be swept under the rug, and I won't let it be." Renata nodded again, clearly understanding that this was far from over. Ruth turned to leave, her head held high as she walked past Charles and Bruno without another word. Their power over her had dissolved, leaving them standing in the wake of their prejudices and mistakes. Ruth stepped out of the gallery, the cold air hitting her face as she walked toward her car. Despite the lingering sting of what she had endured, she felt a sense of victory. She had stood her ground, demanded justice, and made it clear that she wouldn't be silenced. As she drove away, Ruth knew that this was only the beginning of a larger fight, not just for herself but for everyone who had ever been treated as less than because of assumptions and biases. And she was more than ready to fight that battle. Ruth took a deep breath as she walked toward the door, her head held high despite the whirlwind of emotions inside her. The tension in the room remained thick as she passed Charles, Bruno, and Renata, each of them now visibly uncomfortable, the reality of their actions settling in. Renata, still processing what had just transpired, finally broke the silence. "Ruth, please," she started, her voice pleading. "I want to make things right. I know we've made a terrible mistake. I'll do everything I can to ensure this doesn't happen again." Ruth stopped for a moment and turned to face her, her eyes still burning with the pain of the injustice she had endured. "Renata, it's not just about what happened today," Ruth said, her voice firm but controlled. "It's about the culture you've allowed here. This kind of treatment happens too often to people like me. and it's not going to stop unless those in positions of power take responsibility. Renata looked down, clearly wrestling with her guilt and uncertainty. I understand, she said quietly. I'll take action, I promise. Ruth nodded, but she wasn't fully convinced. I hope you do, for the sake of everyone who comes through these doors. And I will be following up to make sure that these promises turn into real change. Charles and Bruno remained silent, their earlier confidence replaced with quiet remorse. Bruno, who had been the instigator of this entire ordeal, could barely meet Ruth's gaze now. Ruth could see that he understood, too late, the weight of his actions. With a final glance at all of them, Ruth turned and walked out of the room. As she stepped back into the gallery, the once welcoming space now felt cold and distant. The art, which she had come to admire, no longer held the same allure. It was a stark reminder of how quickly beauty and serenity could be shattered by prejudice and abuse. Outside the gallery, the air felt cool against her face. Ruth took a moment to breathe deeply, to steady herself. She had won this battle, but she knew there were many more to fight. Today had been a painful reminder of the work that still needed to be done. As she made her way toward her car, Ruth's phone buzzed again. It was the mayor's assistant, Ruth. The voice said warmly, "The mayor wants to thank you for your patience and resilience. He'll be in touch personally to ensure this incident is handled appropriately." "Thank you," Ruth replied, her voice still filled with emotion. "I appreciate the support. This can't be allowed to happen again." "We'll make sure of it," the assistant assured her. As Ruth hung up, she felt a mix of relief and exhaustion. She had come to the gallery for peace, but instead she had faced yet another example of the prejudice and systemic injustice that too many people experience daily. Yet despite it all, she had remained strong, fought back, and refused to be silenced. This experience would not be forgotten. Ruth knew she had the power to ensure that what happened today would be the catalyst for real change. It was no longer just about her, it was about everyone who had been treated unjustly, and she was determined to continue the fight for civil rights and equality. As she drove away, Ruth felt the weight of the day lift, replaced by a renewed sense of purpose. She had faced humiliation, but she had reclaimed her dignity. Now it was time to make sure that the world would hear her story. Renata, Charles, and Bruno sat in tense silence, absorbing the weight of Dr. Martin's words. The gravity of the situation hung heavily in the air, each of them acutely aware that this was not just a reprimand, it was the beginning of serious repercussions for their actions. The gallery, which had once been a place of art and culture, was now at the center of a scandal that had shaken the community. Renata shifted in her seat, her mind racing as she tried to process the events that had led to this moment. She had known from the moment Ruth left the gallery that the fallout would be severe, but the reality of it was more daunting than she had imagined. As the curator, she had prided herself on creating a welcoming environment, yet here she was, being confronted for her complicity in an act of injustice. Dr. Martin's eyes lingered on Renata, sensing her internal struggle. "You need to reflect on how this happened under your leadership," he said, his tone slightly softened but still firm. "You may have been following procedures, but those procedures were applied without fairness, without compassion. You cannot hide behind policies when the outcome is discrimination." Renata nodded slowly, finally understanding the depth of her failure. "I understand," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I should have questioned what was happening. I should have stopped it." Dr. Martin acknowledged her words with a nod but remained focused on the broader implications. He turned his attention back to Charles and Bruno, who sat stiffly, their earlier confidence completely eroded. "The investigation will determine the next steps, but let me make one thing clear: this type of behavior will not be tolerated. You acted with prejudice and allowed that to dictate your decisions, and that is something this community cannot and will not stand for." The sheriff, who had remained silent throughout the meeting, finally spoke. "This isn't just about what happened to Ruth. This is about setting an example for how we handle these situations moving forward. You've tarnished the reputation of this gallery, and now it's up to us to ensure that justice is served. We will be conducting a thorough investigation into all of your actions, and any evidence of misconduct will be handled accordingly." Charles, his face pale, finally spoke up. "We didn't mean for it to go this far. I was just trying to keep things secure." The sheriff raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "Security does not mean singling out an innocent person based on assumptions. What you did was not about security, it was about power, and you abused it." Bruno remained silent, the realization of his role in the injustice evident on his face. He had been so sure of himself, so certain that his suspicions were justified. But now, Under the scrutiny of the public defender and the sheriff, he couldn't escape the truth. He had acted out of prejudice, and it had led to the wrongful humiliation of someone who had done nothing wrong. Dr. Martin leaned forward, his voice taking on a more measured tone. There's no undoing what's been done to Ruth, but what happens next is important. This gallery has a responsibility to its community, and that means making sure something like this never happens again. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in. You will all be held accountable for your actions. Disciplinary measures will be taken, and this investigation will be thorough. The community expects and deserves nothing less. As the meeting came to a close, Renata, Charles, and Bruno sat in silence, each of them coming to terms with the consequences of their actions. The gravity of the situation was undeniable. The public defender and the sheriff left the room, their final words echoing in their minds: justice would be served. Outside the meeting room, the gallery was abuzz with activity, but the atmosphere was tense. The scandal had spread quickly, and the incident with Ruth was now the talk of the town. People were beginning to question the gallery's practices, and it was clear that change was inevitable. For Ruth, the fight wasn't over. She had made her stand, but she knew there was still work to be done to ensure that no one else would have to endure the same treatment. As she prepared for her meeting with the mayor, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was more than just about her. It was about confronting the systems of discrimination and abuse that still existed, even in places meant to celebrate beauty and culture. Ruth had emerged stronger, her resolve hardened by the injustice she had faced. Now she was ready to lead the charge for change, not just in the gallery, but in the city and beyond. Ruth's footsteps echoed through the streets as she left the Floors gallery behind, but the weight of the day lingered with her, along with a growing sense of determination. She had spoken truth to power and confronted injustice head-on, and now, as she walked under the setting sun, she felt the impact of what had just transpired. The meeting with the public defender and gallery staff had ended, but the fight for equality and respect was only beginning. As Ruth looked up at the sky, she felt a sense of resolve, knowing that her words had struck a chord with those in the room. She had demanded more than an apology. She had demanded accountability and action. And while she had made her voice heard in that meeting, she knew her work wasn't done. The incident was more than a single act of discrimination. It was a reminder of the systemic issues that had to be dismantled piece by piece. With every step she took, the weight of her bag on her shoulder seemed lighter, no longer a reminder of the humiliation she had endured, but a symbol of the fight she had carried with grace. She could feel the eyes of the world beginning to turn toward her, recognizing the injustice she had faced and the courage with which she had confronted it. As she reached the end of the block, Ruth glanced back at the gallery one last time. The building, with its pristine walls and artistic displays, looked unchanged from the outside, but inside something profound had shifted. Ruth knew that her story would ripple through the gallery, through the city, and beyond. It was the beginning of change, the start of something bigger than her own experience, and that knowledge filled her with a renewed sense of purpose. She knew that what had happened wasn't just about her. It was about every person who had ever been followed, scrutinized, or mistreated simply because of who they were. It was about fighting against the subtle yet pervasive forces of racism and prejudice that still stained the world. And Ruth wasn't going to let this moment slip away. She would continue to fight, to speak out, and to demand justice. Ruth's mind was already racing with plans. She would meet with the mayor, ensure that the investigation into the gallery was thorough, and use this moment as a catalyst for wider change. She would speak at community forums, lead discussions, and use her platform as a civil rights activist to push for tangible reform. There was so much work to be done, and Ruth was ready for it. As she continued down the street, the shadows lengthening in the fading daylight, Ruth allowed herself a small smile. Today had been a battle, but it was far from the last. Her voice had been heard, her dignity reclaimed, and the fire of justice burned brighter than ever. This is just the beginning, Ruth thought again, her heart swelling with both the weight of the struggle and the promise of victory. I won't stop until justice is no longer something we have to fight for, but something that is freely given to everyone, everywhere. And with that, Ruth walked on, knowing that the future was hers to shape one step, one voice, and one act of courage at a time. Inside the gallery, the atmosphere had irrevocably changed. The usual buzz of conversations and quiet admiration of art was now underscored by a sense of reckoning. Staff moved with a subdued awareness, their actions more deliberate, as if they were reconsidering everything they had once taken for granted. Visitors, too, felt the shift, though many didn't know the full story. They could sense the gravity of what had transpired, and whispers of the incident rippled quietly through the space. If you're still tuned into this video and find the story inspiring, drop a 7 in the comments to let me know you're still with me. Renata, Bruno, and Charles carried the weight of the consequences in different ways. Renata, who had prided herself on being a curator of art and culture, now understood that her responsibility went beyond curating exhibitions. She realized she had failed to curate an environment of inclusion and equality. The experience had shaken her, forcing her to confront the uncomfortable truth that her leadership had allowed an environment where discrimination could flourish unchecked. She vowed to take the lessons of the incident to heart, committing herself to transformative leadership that would prioritize human dignity alongside the gallery's artistic mission. Bruno, who had once stood confident in his judgments, now wrestled with the uncomfortable knowledge of his own bias. His actions, driven by snap judgments and unfounded suspicions, had led to an unnecessary and unjust situation. Bruno understood that his job was about more than enforcing rules. It was about protecting people, all people equally. The performance review and re-education program he was set to undergo would be grueling, but he was determined to emerge from it. He knew now that if he didn't actively work to challenge his biases, they would continue to shape his actions in harmful ways. Charles, as head of security, had taken his role seriously, but in all the wrong ways. He had enforced authority without considering the ethical responsibilities that came with it. His suspension hit him hard, but it also provided a much-needed moment of reflection. The training on civil rights and ethics he was required to undergo was not merely about keeping his job, it was about redefining how he viewed his role and his responsibility to those who entered the gallery. Protecting the gallery meant more than safeguarding art, it meant safeguarding the people who came to experience it. The gallery's administration, shaken by the incident's visibility and impact, took swift action. The investigation led by the public defender and the city sheriff uncovered gaps in policies that should have protected visitors like Ruth. In response, the gallery implemented a series of reforms aimed at ensuring that no visitor would face the kind of discrimination Ruth had endured. Training programs on implicit bias and human rights became mandatory for all employees, and new checks were introduced to prevent abuses of power. The gallery's leadership made a public commitment to change, acknowledging that art could not exist in a vacuum devoid of social responsibility. For Ruth, this incident marked a significant step in her journey toward justice, but she knew the work was far from finished. The consequences dealt to Renata, Bruno, and Charles weren't about personal retribution. They were about creating a space where future visitors wouldn't have to endure the same humiliations. Ruth's goal wasn't punishment, it was progress. She watched as the gallery took its first steps toward becoming a place of inclusion. And though there was a long way to go, Ruth believed in the power of change. Her fight for justice had never been about one moment or one person. It was about creating a world where everyone could walk through doors, into galleries, into workplaces, into life, and be treated with the respect and dignity they deserved. As Ruth walked into the next chapter of her work as a civil rights activist, she carried the lessons of the gallery with her. She knew that change didn't come all at once. It came through persistent effort, through holding institutions and individuals accountable, through demanding better. She had seen what could happen when voices were raised and heard, and with that knowledge, Ruth continued her fight with even greater determination, knowing that each step forward brought the world closer to the justice she sought for all. The gallery, once a symbol of exclusion for her, had now become a space of potential transformation, proof that even the most entrenched systems could be made to change, one step at a time. As we come to the end of this powerful story, it's time to reflect on everything we've learned. Ruth's journey through the Floors Gallery was not just a personal experience, it was a reminder of the systemic injustices that still exist in our world. Her strength and determination in the face of prejudice have inspired a necessary conversation about equality, respect, and the responsibility we all carry to create a more just society. Now we want to hear from you. What is one lesson from Ruth's story that stood out to you? How will you bring that lesson into practice in your own life? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We encourage you to be part of the conversation and the change. If you liked this video, please leave your comment below. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Together we can keep raising our voices for justice and equality.